She stood barefoot on that wooden platform in the blazing Arizona heat, her hands scarred, her head high, while the whole town laughed and men threw out insults like pocket change. 56 years old, sold by her own nephew for a bag of cornmeal. That was the day Margaret Whitmore learned exactly what the world thought she was worth. But it was also the day one quiet, broken rancher stepped through that crowd and changed everything. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow Margaret's journey all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it happened, Margaret Whitmore woke before the sun. That had always been her way. 56 years of early mornings, starting before the world asked anything of her. Moving through the dark kitchen with her hands already knowing what to do. Bread, fire, water from the well. The quiet, steady labor of a woman who had built her life from the ground up 3 separate times and never once asked anyone to notice. She had not expected this morning to be different. She had been wrong. Her nephew Clarence was already awake when she came downstairs. That alone should have warned her. Clarence never woke early. Clarence barely worked at all. He had shown up at her door 14 months ago with a broken wagon, a string of excuses, and the particular kind of smile that men wear when they're about to take something from you. She had taken him in anyway, because he was family, because that was what she did. "Aunt Margaret!" He didn't look at her when he said it. He stood at the kitchen table with his hat already on, turning something over in his hands. "We need to talk." She set the cast-iron skillet on the stove. "Then talk." "The farm's gone under." She turned slowly. "I know that, Clarence. We've been working to fix it." "There ain't no fixin' it." He finally looked up, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not shame. Something harder than shame. Calculation. "I've been talking to some men in town about options." "What kind of options?" He set down what he'd been holding. It was a folded piece of paper. She crossed the room and picked it up, and it took her 3 full seconds to understand what she was reading. It was a labor contract. Her name was on it. "Clarence." Her voice came out very quiet. "What is this?" "It's just a contract. Mr. Dawes at the general store runs these arrangements sometimes. When a family can't pay their debts, they put up a worker to cover what's owed. It's legal, Aunt Margaret. It's done all the time." "It is not done all the time." "It is out here, in the territory." He stood up straighter. "Look, I owe money to 4 different men in Red Creek. I got nothing left to sell. The property's mortgaged. The cattle are gone. The only thing I've got—" "Don't." The word came out like a door slamming, but Clarence kept going. "The only thing I've got left is the contract on your labor. 6 months of work service covers the debt. That's all. It ain't permanent." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the winter she had spent nursing his mother, her sister, through pneumonia. She thought about the 2 years she had worked her late husband's farm alone after he died, before it finally broke her completely. She thought about every meal she had cooked, every fence she had mended, every morning she had gotten up before the sun and refused to let the darkness beat her. She set the paper back on the table. "I won't sign that." "You already did." The kitchen went completely silent. "What did you say?" Clarence picked up his hat. "I had you sign it last week with the land papers. It was in the stack. You didn't read all the way through." He had the decency to look away when he said it, but only barely. "I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret. I truly am. But I didn't have a choice." She stood perfectly still. She had spent 56 years learning how to stand still when the ground fell out from under her. How to breathe when breathing felt impossible. How to hold her face together when everything inside was coming apart. She did that now. "Get out of my kitchen," she said. "Aunt Margaret, get Out!" He left, and Margaret Whitmore stood alone at that kitchen stove for a long time, her hands braced on the edge of the counter, the cast iron skillet cold and useless in front of her. She breathed. She held herself together. She told herself that she had survived worse than this. She had survived a husband who drank, a baby she'd buried at 2 months old, a drought that took 3 consecutive harvests. She had survived being widowed at 44, with nothing but a piece of land and 2 mules. She had survived all of it. She could survive this. What she hadn't counted on was the auction. The town square of Red Creek smelled like horse sweat and sawdust, and the particular kind of cruelty that men perform when they have an audience. Clarence had brought her there just after 9 in the morning, holding her signed contract like it gave him some kind of power he'd never actually earned. He handed her off to a man named Abe Dawes, short, pale, with the soft hands of someone who had never done a day of physical work. And Dawes had led her toward the wooden platform in the center of the square, like this was perfectly ordinary. Like this was just another transaction. There were maybe 40 people gathered, more drifting in as word spread. Margaret recognized faces she had seen in church, in the dry goods store, at the edge of her nephew's property line. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Most of them looked curious. A few of them looked entertained. She kept her chin up. That was the only decision she could make in that moment. She could not undo the signed contract. She could not take back 14 months of goodwill, extended to a man who had been using her from the first day. She could not rewind any of it. But she could hold her chin up. Dawes climbed up beside her and raised his voice. "Good morning, good people of Red Creek. Now, I know this ain't the usual sort of business we conduct, but circumstances being what they are, we've got a fine opportunity for any household or working ranch that needs experienced help. One Margaret Whitmore, 56 years of age, strong constitution, skilled in cooking, mending, farm work, and general management. 6-month labor contract, fully legal and documented. Starting bid is $2. The crowd stirred. $2, someone said. For 6 months? She'll eat more than she earns, a man near the back called out, and several people laughed. Margaret looked straight ahead. She found a fixed point on the far edge of the square, a weather vane on top of the feed store, and she stared at it. She breathed slow and even. She did not let her hands shake, though they wanted to. "Now, let's not be hasty," Dawes said, grinning. "She's experienced. Anyone who's been keeping house and farm for 30-odd years knows what they're doing. Think of it as hiring with a guarantee." "Hiring what exactly?" another voice said. Laughter again. "She's too old to be useful," a woman near the front said, not unkindly. "Just a simple observation. The way you might note that a wagon wheel was cracked. Wouldn't last through harvest." "I've lasted through 56 harvests," Margaret said, loud and clear. The crowd went briefly quiet. Then someone laughed, and the murmuring started up again. Dawes raised his gavel. "Do I hear $2.50? $2 to start, $2.50 if anyone's feeling—" "Stop." The word came from the edge of the crowd. Not loud, not theatrical, just completely, utterly certain. People turned. A man pushed through the circle of onlookers. Not roughly, but steadily, like water finding its level. Tall, wide across the shoulders in a way that came from work, not vanity. His coat was trail-dusted, and his hat had seen better days, and there was a long scar along his jaw that she would later learn came from a fence wire in a winter storm. He walked like a man who had long since stopped caring whether people moved out of his way or not. Not aggressive, just decided. He stepped up onto the platform, and Margaret Whitmore got her first good look at Daniel Carter. He was younger than her by at least 20 years, maybe more. He had dark eyes and a set to his jaw that suggested he had made a decision several minutes ago and was only now catching up to it. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Dawes. "This ends now," he said. Dawes blinked. "Mr. Carter, this is illegal. I don't care what it is." Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He set it on the edge of the platform, and it landed with a heavy, deliberate sound. The sound of real money. "That covers whatever debt is attached to this contract, plus interest. Count it." The crowd had gone very quiet. Dawes stared at the pouch. "Now, see here. The terms of the contract state—" "I said count it." Dawes counted it. His expression shifted in the way that expressions always shift when the math comes out in someone else's favor, and there's nothing left to argue. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the pouch again. "This is 3 months' wages," he said. "It's what the debt is worth, and you know it." Daniel's voice stayed even. "The contract is paid. She's free." Clarence appeared from somewhere in the crowd. His face had gone the color of old milk. "Now wait just a minute. That ain't how this works. I signed that contract, and the terms say—" Daniel turned and looked at him. Just looked at him. Clarence stopped talking. "You brought your own flesh and blood to a public auction?" Daniel said. Not angry, just quiet and clear and absolutely devastating. "You stood there and let strangers bid on her life for $2. He paused. "I don't know what kind of man does that. I don't particularly want to." Clarence's mouth worked like he had something to say. Nothing came out. Daniel picked up the paid contract from Dawes' hand, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. Then he turned to Margaret. She had not moved. She was still standing exactly as she had been standing for the last 15 minutes. Spine straight, chin level, hands quiet at her sides. But something in her face had shifted in a way she couldn't quite control. Not tears. She refused tears. Just a loosening, somewhere deep behind her eyes, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years, finally finding some slack. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Daniel Carter. I've got a ranch about 15 miles south. I could use someone who knows what they're doing, if you're willing. You'd have your own room, fair wages, your own say in how things run." He paused. "And no one puts you on a platform again. Ever. I give you my word on that." She looked at him for a long moment. She had lived 56 years in a world that had very specific ideas about what she was worth. As a young woman, she'd been worth a marriage. As a working woman, she'd been worth her labor. As a widow, she'd been worth the land under her feet. And when that was gone, she'd been worth, apparently, a $2 opening bid. This man was offering her something different. She wasn't sure yet what to make of it. "What happened to your last housekeeper?" she asked. Something moved across his face, brief and honest. "I ain't had one. Ranch has been running short-handed for about 3 years." "What happened 3 years ago?" The briefest pause. "I lost my wife and daughter to fever. That summer." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Carter." "I'm sorry for yours, ma'am. Whatever brought you here?" The crowd had started to murmur again, the ordinary noise of 40 people recalibrating from entertainment to something they hadn't expected. Margaret was only vaguely aware of it. She was looking at this man who had thrown 3 months of wages down on a platform for a woman he had never met, and she was trying to determine what it was he wanted in return, because in her experience, men always wanted something in return. "I'm not a charity case," she said plainly. "No, ma'am, you are not. I'll work for my wages, same as any hand. That's all I'm asking. And I'll speak my mind when I think something's being done wrong." A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. I'd expect nothing less. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she stepped down from that platform, not waiting for help, not looking back at Dawes, or at Clarence, or at the 40 curious faces watching. And she walked to stand beside Daniel Carter on solid ground. "All right, Mr. Carter," she said. "Show me this ranch of yours." The ride south took 2 hours. Margaret sat on the bench of Daniel's wagon, with her single bag at her feet, and the Arizona summer pressing down on everything like a flat, hot hand. She had left Clarence's house with exactly what she had arrived with 14 months ago. 3 dresses, a pair of boots, her late husband's Bible, and a small tin box that held the only photograph she had of her baby girl. Gone 30 years now. It wasn't much. She had learned not to be attached to things. Things broke. Things got left behind. Things got signed over by nephews who smiled when they lied to your face. What you carried in your chest, that was yours. No one could put a contract on that. Daniel drove without talking much, which she appreciated. He pointed out landmarks when they passed them. The dry creek bed that flooded every spring. The ridge where you could see clear to the next county on a good day. The old Navarro homestead standing empty now. Not filling the silence with noise, just offering what seemed useful. She watched the land and thought about what she was riding into. She was not naive. She was 56 years old, and she had never once been naive. A man who paid off her labor contract and offered her a room and wages was either a genuinely decent human being, or he was something else entirely. And she intended to find out which before she let herself trust a single word of it. But she had also spent the last 30 years developing a particular skill: reading men. The ones who kept eye contact too long. The ones who smiled with their mouths and not their eyes. The ones who offered too much too quickly, or whose generosity always came with a shape to it, a particular shape that pointed back toward themselves. Daniel Carter hadn't done any of those things. He had kept his distance on that platform. He had spoken to her like she was a person, not a transaction. He had let her walk to him rather than pulling her along. And when she'd asked difficult questions, he had answered them plainly, including the one about his wife and daughter, which most men would have deflected. She was reserving judgment, but she was reserving it cautiously. "How many head of cattle?" she asked, about an hour into the ride. "About 40. Used to be 200. He said it without self-pity, just fact. "Lost most of them the same year I lost." The same year. Didn't have the energy to rebuild the herd, and I made some bad decisions about the land. The main house is solid. Fencing needs work. Barn standing, but the south wall is soft. "Any hands?" "One. Boy named Jesse, 16. Good worker, not much experience." He paused. "Truth is, Mrs. Whitmore, the ranch is in rough shape. I want to be honest with you about that." "I appreciate honesty." "I also want to be clear. What you do on the ranch is your decision. I'm not looking for someone to order around. I'm looking for someone who knows how to run a household and has the good sense to make decisions without being asked every 5 minutes. She studied the side of his face. "You've been running a dying ranch alone for 3 years. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because leaving felt like letting go of something I wasn't ready to let go of." She understood that. She understood it in a way she didn't try to put into words. She had done the same thing, stayed in places long past when she should have left. Because leaving meant accepting that something was actually over. "How long before the ranch pays again?" she asked. "A good season, maybe 2. If the water holds, and we get the south fields planted before August." He glanced at her. "Do you know crop work?" "I know crop work. I know cattle. I know what a sick animal looks like before it goes down. And I know how to cut losses before they get worse. I know how to manage a household on almost nothing. And I know how to make 40 head of cattle look like more than they are to anyone watching from the outside. She paused. I also know how to read men who mean trouble. You get to the edge of a territory, you learn that fast. He nodded slowly. That'll be useful. Why? Because there's a man named Blackwood who's been trying to buy this valley for 2 years. He said it simply. He wants the water rights. My land sits on the last clean aquifer between here and the county line. He's made 3 offers, and I've turned him down 3 times. And he's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. Margaret looked out at the land spreading away from the road, the dry grass and red rock, and the particular quality of Arizona's summer light that made everything look like it was already on fire. Tell me about Blackwood, she said. So Daniel told her. Edgar Blackwood had come into the valley 6 years ago with money from back east and a very specific plan. Buy out every small rancher in the territory, consolidate the water rights, and charge whatever the market would bear to everyone who needed it. He had bought out 9 ranches. 3 families had sold under pressure. 1 had simply disappeared one winter, and their property had turned up in Blackwood's name by spring. He had men who worked for him, not cowhands, men. The kind who got paid for persuasion. Anyone ever go to the marshal? Margaret asked. Marshal's in Blackwood's pocket. Has been for 2 years. Daniel's voice was level, but she heard something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something older. The kind of tiredness that comes from watching injustice operate in plain sight and knowing you can't fight it alone. The federal circuit judge comes through twice a year, but by the time he comes, things have always resolved themselves somehow. Evidence disappears, witnesses change their statements, but they haven't moved against you directly. Not yet. They've cut my fence twice, poisoned a section of water upstream last fall, killed 8 cattle before I found the source. He paused. They're patient. They've been wearing me down slow, waiting for me to get tired enough to sell. And are you? A long pause. I was, he said finally. Until this morning. Margaret turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead, both hands steady on the reins. What happened this morning that changed your mind? She asked, though she thought she already knew. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different, quieter and more careful, like someone handling something fragile. I walked past that auction on my way to the feed store, he said. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for anything. And then I saw you standing up there, and I saw your face. You weren't scared. 50 people watching, and you were holding your head like you were standing in your own kitchen, like you refused to let them have that. He stopped. I don't know. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? He took a moment. That some things are worth fighting for, even when you're tired. The wagon rolled on through the summer heat. The ranch appeared at the end of a long track through scrub brush and dry grass. A weathered main house, a barn, a water trough with a cracked edge, a fence line that sagged in 3 visible places from 50 yards away. It was rough. There was no question about that. But Margaret Whitmore had seen rough before. She had built something from rough before. She climbed down from that wagon before Daniel could offer a hand, and she stood in the yard of the Carter Ranch with her single bag and her late husband's Bible and her tin box with a photograph inside. And she looked at everything that needed doing. Then she rolled up her sleeves. All right, she said. Show me the kitchen. Jesse, the 16-year-old hand, was watching from the barn door with his mouth slightly open. Daniel almost smiled. Jesse, come meet Mrs. Whitmore. Jesse came over slowly, hat in hand. Ma'am? "How long have you been working this ranch?" she asked him. 8 months, ma'am." "Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you mend fence?" "Getting better at it." "Good. We'll start on the south section tomorrow morning, first light." She glanced at Daniel. "I'll need a full accounting of what's in the pantry, and I want to look at the cattle this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that she catalogued without quite understanding yet. A kind of relief, or maybe something more than relief. The sound of a man who had been holding something up alone for a very long time, finally feeling another pair of hands take hold. She didn't think about that for long. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. The pantry had enough for about 2 weeks of basic meals, but the organization was non-existent. Dried beans mixed with hardware items. Cured meat stored too close to damp wood. A sack of cornmeal with a hole in it that was slowly losing its contents across the shelf. The stove needed cleaning badly. The water line from the outdoor pump had a slow leak that was rotting the floor near the south wall. She worked through the afternoon without stopping. Daniel came and went, checking in without hovering, which she appreciated. He brought her a cup of water once without being asked, and set it on the counter beside her without comment. Small thing. She noted it. By evening, she had the kitchen organized, the stove cleaned, a pot of beans on with enough salt pork to make it worth eating, and a list of what needed to be bought at the dry goods store. She had also identified the floor rot and determined it could be patched without rebuilding the whole wall. She was standing at the kitchen window when Daniel came in for supper. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "What?" "It looks different in here." "It was a mess." "I know." A pause. "Smells different, too." "Food does that when it's actually cooking." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She heard him pull out a chair at the kitchen table. "Jesse eat yet?" she asked. "I'll call him." "Do that." She turned from the window. "And Mr. Carter, I want to talk about Blackwood." He met her eyes. "All right." "Tell me everything you know about his operation. How many men he keeps on his property. Whether any of the other Valley ranches have talked about organizing. Whether the newspaper out of Phoenix has ever run anything on him." He studied her face for a moment. "That's a lot of questions for your first evening." "If trouble's coming," she said, "I'd rather know the shape of it." He nodded slowly. Then he went to call Jesse for supper. And outside the window, the Arizona summer stretched on in all directions. The long red light of evening across the dry grass. The heat still rising off the earth. The whole territory laid out like a question waiting to be answered. Margaret Whitmore had been bought and sold that morning. By nightfall, she was already building something. She didn't know yet exactly what, but she knew the shape of beginnings. She had built enough of them to recognize one when she was standing inside it. The beans were good. Margaret knew they were good, not because she tasted them. She always tasted what she cooked. That was just sense. But because Jesse ate 2 full bowls without looking up once, and then sat back in his chair with a particular expression of a boy who had been surviving on bad food for too long and had just remembered what the other kind felt like. Daniel ate quietly, steadily. He didn't compliment the food, which she also appreciated. Men who fell over themselves complimenting a meal were usually men who wanted something. He just ate, and refilled his bowl once, and when he set down his spoon, he looked across the table at her with a directness she was still getting used to. "You wanted to talk about Blackwood," he said. "I did." She folded her hands on the table. "Start from the beginning." So he did. Edgar Blackwood had arrived in the Red Creek Valley 6 years ago, And the thing people always got wrong about him, Daniel said, was assuming he was stupid because he was crude. He wasn't stupid. He was methodical. He moved slow and he moved deliberate, and by the time most people understood what he was doing, it was already half done. He had bought the first 3 ranches legally. Fair offers, even generous ones. He was building goodwill, establishing himself as a reasonable man. Then the prices he offered started dropping. Then the pressure started. Small things at first. A water line cut here, a fence broken there, a rumor spreading that a certain property had a legal dispute attached to it that would take years to resolve. None of it provable, all of it effective. The Navarro family, Daniel said. You saw their place on the way in. Abandoned. I saw it. Esteban Navarro had 3 sons and 40 years in that land. He told Blackwood no, twice. Daniel's voice stayed flat. 3rd winter, his eldest son got thrown from a horse on open ground that he'd ridden 1,000 times. Broke his back. 6 months later, Esteban sold, packed up his family, and left. He paused. The horse was fine, by the way. No injury at all. The table was quiet for a moment. Jesse was staring at his empty bowl. He was 16, but his face in that moment looked younger than that. The face of a boy who had heard this story before and still hadn't found a way to make peace with it. How many ranches does he own now? Margaret asked. 11. Mine would make 12. And with my water rights, he'd control the aquifer for the whole southern valley. Every rancher between here and Maricopa County would have to buy access from him. Daniel looked at her steadily. He knows it. I know it. The difference between us is that he's willing to do things I'm not. So far, Margaret said. Something shifted in his expression. So far, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. Who else is still holding out? 4 families. The Pattersons, the Okafor brothers, old widow Chen on the North Ridge, and a homesteader named Briggs, who's been here longer than anyone. He paused. They're all scared. They've watched what happened to their neighbors. Most of them are one bad season away from folding anyway. Blackwood knows that too. He's just waiting. What if they weren't scared? Margaret said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? I mean, what if they knew someone was standing firm? Not just surviving, but actually pushing back. She kept her voice practical, not dramatic. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. If your ranch starts turning around, visibly, publicly, in ways the whole valley can see, it changes the calculation for everyone else. Jesse looked up from his bowl. For the first time all evening, he looked like he was paying close attention. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That's a considerable strategy for your first night here, he said. I've had a considerable day, she replied. She slept that night in the small room at the back of the house. A cot, a window, a hook on the wall for her coat. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. The creak of the barn, the low movement of cattle somewhere out in the dark, the particular silence of wide-open land that never felt entirely silent, just breathing in its own way. She thought about Clarence, not with grief. She had moved past grief on that wagon ride south, but with a kind of clear, cold assessment. She had trusted him because he was family, and family, she had believed, was the last anchor in a drifting world. She had been wrong about that. Or rather, she had been wrong about him. The anchor had been rotten the whole time, and she hadn't let herself see it. She wouldn't make that mistake again. What she would do was this. She would work. She would rebuild this ranch the same way she had rebuilt everything else in her life. Methodically, practically, without sentimentality. And she would figure out Edgar Blackwood before Edgar Blackwood figured out her. She was asleep before she finished the thought. The first week moved fast. Margaret had a gift that she'd never thought of as a gift because it had always just been necessary. She could look at a broken system and see exactly which pieces needed to move first. Not all of them, not the overwhelming whole, just the first piece, and then the next, and then the one after that. The south fence came first. She and Jessie worked it for 2 full days while Daniel handled the cattle, pulling wire, resetting posts, working in the full hammer of the Arizona summer without complaint. Jessie was stronger than he looked, and he learned fast once he understood that she wasn't going to explain something twice. "Why the south fence first?" he asked her on the second afternoon, driving a post while she held the tension wire. "Because Blackwood's property borders us on the south," she said. "A broken fence is an invitation. A standing fence is a statement." Jessie thought about that. "You think he's watching?" "I think men like Blackwood always have someone watching." She tested the wire tension. "So, we put on a good show." The pantry mixed. She sat with Daniel the third evening, and they went through the accounts together. What was owed, what was coming in from the small cattle sales, what was a realistic timeline for the south fields if they got seed in the ground by the end of the month. It was honest, and it was uncomfortable, because the numbers were bad. Not catastrophic, but close. A single bad event, a sick herd, another cut water line, anything, and the margin disappeared entirely. "We need more income," she said plainly. "Something that doesn't depend on the cattle." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I've thought about that. There's demand at the Red Creek Hotel for fresh eggs and bread. I just never had anyone to—" "I can do that. Twice a week." She wrote it down. "We'll need 6 more hens. That's an investment, but it pays back in 60 days. He looked at the numbers she'd written. "You do this fast." "I've had to." He nodded slowly. He had a habit of doing that, nodding slowly when she said something that landed somewhere deeper than the words themselves. She noticed it, without remarking on it. What she also noticed, though she kept it carefully filed away without examining it too closely, was that he never made her feel like she was working for him. He made her feel like they were working together. It was a small distinction and a significant one, and she didn't entirely trust it yet. But she was starting to. The first real trouble came on a Wednesday. Margaret was in the side yard with the newly arrived chickens when she heard a rider coming up the track fast. She straightened and shaded her eyes and saw a boy, maybe 14, pushing a horse harder than was smart in the midday heat. He pulled up in the yard, with the animal's sides heaving and his own face white under the sunburn. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He'd been asking around, apparently. Found out a woman was running things at the Carter Ranch. "That's me," she said. "Ma'am, my name's Thomas Patterson. My daddy sent me. He says Blackwood's men came this morning and told him he's got 3 days to sign the sale papers, or they're going to claim the property under some kind of debt notice." The boy's voice cracked. "My daddy says the debt notice is fake. He never borrowed from Blackwood, but the marshal is backing it, and he doesn't know what to do." Margaret looked at the boy for one moment. Steady. Thinking. "Get off that horse and give him some water," she said. "Then come inside." She had Thomas eat something. He'd ridden 11 miles in the heat, and he was shakier than he was letting on. And then she sent Jessie to find Daniel, who was in the east pasture. By the time Daniel came in, she had already written down everything Thomas had told her in careful detail. Dates, names, the specific language of the debt notice, as Thomas remembered it. Daniel read her notes standing at the kitchen counter. His jaw tightened. "A fraudulent debt notice, backed by the marshal," he said. "That's new. He's escalating." "He's escalating because something changed," Margaret said. What changed? Daniel looked up at her. You showed up, he said. She hadn't expected that answer. Me? The south fence went up. The fields are getting planted. Word travels in a valley this small. He set down the notes. Blackwood's been watching this ranch fall apart for 3 years. Now suddenly, it's pulling back together. He's not patient enough to wait and see what that means. Thomas was watching them from the kitchen table with the expression of a boy who had come for help and was now trying to calculate whether he'd found it. Margaret turned to him. Is your father willing to fight this? Thomas swallowed. He's scared, ma'am. I didn't ask if he was scared. I asked if he was willing. A pause. He said if there was someone standing with him, he would. Then go home and tell him to get that debt notice in writing, if he hasn't already. Every document Blackwood's men gave him, he keeps. He shows it to no one except us and eventually a federal judge. She looked at Daniel. There's a federal circuit judge. When does he come through next? 6 weeks, Daniel said. 6 weeks. She looked back at Thomas. Your father holds for 6 weeks. Can he do that? Thomas straightened in his chair. He was trying very hard not to look like a boy. Yes, ma'am. I think he can. Good. Tell him Daniel Carter is holding too. And tell him he's not alone. After Thomas left, fed, watered, carrying the words back to his father like something fragile, Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. You just made a promise on behalf of this ranch, he said. I did. If Blackwood decides to move fast, then we move faster. She met his eyes. You told me this morning that you were ready to stop waiting. Did you mean that? A long pause. His dark eyes held hers without flinching. Yes, he said. Then we stop waiting. She picked up her list from the counter. I'm going to need you to ride to the Okafor brothers tomorrow, and to the widow Chen. I want to know where they stand. He stared at her for a moment. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile she was starting to recognize. You really don't stop, he said. I stopped once, she replied. Cost me 14 months and my dignity. I don't intend to repeat it. The widow Chen was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 63 who had run her Northridge property alone for 9 years and regarded everyone who came to her door with a professional suspicion that Margaret respected immediately. When Daniel brought Margaret along on the second day, Chen had opened the door, looked at her for about 4 seconds, and said, You're the woman from the auction. I am, Margaret said. Chen studied her. Blackwood's man was here last week. Offered me $1,200 for the property. What did you say? I said the property was worth $4,000, and he could take his $1,200 and put it somewhere uncomfortable. She paused. Then I loaded my shotgun and left it on the porch while we talked. Margaret almost smiled. Are you willing to stand with the Patterson family if it comes to a legal fight? Chen's eyes narrowed. What kind of legal fight? The kind that involves a federal judge and documented evidence of fraudulent debt claims. Margaret kept her voice steady. Blackwood's changing tactics. He's manufacturing debt notices now, backed by the marshal. If we can gather enough testimony from enough ranchers before the federal circuit comes through, testimony, documented, in writing, he loses his legal cover. The marshal loses his position, and Blackwood loses his leverage. Chen was quiet for a long moment. A hawk rode a thermal overhead in the silence. Neither woman looked at it. You've been here less than 2 weeks, Chen said. Yes. And you're already organizing. Someone has to. Another pause. Chen looked past her at Daniel, who was standing at the edge of the yard holding both horses, and very deliberately not inserting himself into this conversation. Then she looked back at Margaret. "My husband built this property from bare ground," she said quietly. "He died on this land. My son was born on this land." Something moved across her face. Grief and fury in equal measure, old and well-worn, like stones smoothed by a long river. "Blackwood offered me $1,200. Like 40 years of my family's life is worth $1,200? "It's not," Margaret said. "No," Chen said. "It is not." She straightened. "What do you need from me?" By the end of the second week, Margaret had spoken to 4 families. 3 of them were in. The Okafor brothers took the most convincing. They were practical men who thought in terms of odds, and the odds, they pointed out, were not favorable. Blackwood had money. He had the marshal. He had men who were paid to make problems disappear. "What do we have?" the older brother Samuel asked. "We have the truth," Margaret said. "And in 6 weeks, we'll have a federal judge." "That's a thin hand to play." "It is," she agreed. "But it's the hand we've got. And thin hands win sometimes, when the people holding them don't fold." Samuel looked at his brother. His brother shrugged in a way that said, "She's not wrong." They were in. Margaret kept every document in a locked tin box under her cot, the same one that held her daughter's photograph. She added to it every few days, notes from conversations, dates and details, the careful paper architecture of a case that did not exist yet, but was slowly taking shape. Daniel watched her build it. He didn't interfere. He also didn't stay out of it. He rode when she asked him to ride, talked to men she directed him to talk to, brought back information with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He was, she was discovering, a man who took direction without taking offense, which was rarer than it should have been. One evening, he came back from a ride to find her at the kitchen table, with the documents spread out, cross-referencing dates on 2 different land notices. He set a cup of coffee beside her without being asked. She looked up. He was already moving toward the door. "Mr. Carter." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the coffee, and for—" She paused, not entirely sure how to finish the sentence. "For not making this harder. For listening. For the way you showed up to that auction and didn't make it about yourself. For everything," she said finally. He turned and looked at her for a moment. The evening light was coming through the west window, and it caught the gray at his temples that she hadn't noticed before. He was younger than her, yes, but not as young as she'd first thought. He had lived in his face. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She set down her pen. "Blackwood knows you're here." He said it carefully, watching her face. "One of his men was in Red Creek yesterday, asking about the woman who took up at the Carter Ranch, who she was, where she came from." He paused. "He knows your name." The kitchen was very still. "And?" she said. "And I want you to know that if you want to leave, if this is more than you signed on for, I will not think less of you, not for a single moment." His voice was low and direct. "You came here to work a ranch, not to go to war with Edgar Blackwood." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. "I came here," she said, "because a man paid 3 months of wages for my dignity and gave me a room and a fair shake. And now I find out that same man has been standing alone for 3 years against someone who poisons water and breaks backs and buys marshals." She looked down at her documents. "So no, Mr. Carter, I'm not leaving." A pause. "Not until this is finished," she said. Daniel Carter stood in that kitchen doorway in the last of the evening light, and something in his face changed, quiet and deep, and not entirely hidden. And Margaret Whitmore chose not to look at it directly, because she was not ready for what it might mean. But she felt it, and she filed it away, careful as everything else, in the place where she kept the things that mattered. Outside, the Arizona summer pushed its heat against every wall of the Carter Ranch. Inside, something stronger was being built, board by board, document by document, alliance by alliance. And Edgar Blackwood, for all his money and his men and his bought marshal, did not yet understand what was coming for him. He would. The document arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked under the water trough like someone had dropped it there by accident. Margaret found it when she went out at first light to check the livestock. A folded piece of paper, sealed with no wax, no marking. She opened it standing right there in the yard, reading it once quickly and then once slowly, the way she read anything that required her full attention. It was a notice. Not a legal notice, not formatted like one, not carrying the marshal's seal. Just a handwritten letter, the penmanship careful and deliberate in the way of someone who had practiced making threats sound reasonable. Mrs. Whitmore, you are new to this valley and perhaps unaware of how things work here. The Carter Ranch is a losing enterprise. Mr. Carter is a stubborn man who will eventually see reason or suffer the consequences of not doing so. You would be wise to consider your position carefully before aligning yourself with a losing side. There are better opportunities available to a woman of your capabilities. This is offered in goodwill. No signature. She folded it precisely along its original creases and put it in her apron pocket and went back inside and made breakfast. She didn't mention it to Daniel until Jessie had gone out to the east pasture. Then she set it on the kitchen table in front of him and watched his face while he read it. His jaw tightened. His hand flattened against the table. He read it twice, same as she had. He wrote to you directly, Daniel said. He's trying to separate us. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. If he can convince me I'm on the wrong side, he loses a problem. He thinks I'm here because I had nowhere else to go. He thinks I can be peeled away with a soft offer. Can you? She looked at him steadily. What do you think? He looked at the letter again. Something moved through his expression. Anger, yes, but underneath it, something more complicated. Something that looked like worry. Not for himself. I don't like that he knows enough about you to write this, he said quietly. It means he's been asking around. Probably knows about Clarence. Knows how I ended up on that platform. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He thinks that makes me vulnerable. A woman who got sold by her own family. She must be desperate. She must be looking for any safe harbor she can find. And he's right that I was desperate. He's wrong about what desperate people do. Her voice was calm and certain. Desperate people who have nothing left to lose are the most dangerous people in any fight. I would have thought a man like Blackwood would know that. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We need to move faster." "Yes," she said, "we do." They were already 4 weeks into the 6 weeks before the federal circuit judge arrived. The case Margaret was building in her tin box was solid, but not yet solid enough. She had testimony from 3 families, documentation of 2 fraudulent debt notices, and a carefully written account from Samuel Okafor of a conversation he'd had with one of Blackwood's men 2 years ago, in which the man had explicitly threatened property damage if Samuel didn't sell. Samuel had written it out in his own hand and signed it. But it wasn't enough. She needed someone from inside. She had been thinking about this for days, turning it over the way she turned over every problem. Not impatiently, but persistently, looking at it from different angles. Blackwood's operation ran on men who were paid for loyalty. Most of those men would stay paid. But in any organization built on intimidation, there were always people near the bottom who had seen more than they were comfortable with and were waiting for a reason to say so. The question was finding them. She was thinking about exactly that when Jesse came back in from the pasture at a dead run. He hit the door hard enough to rattle it on its hinges, breathing like he'd sprinted the last quarter mile. Margaret and Daniel were both on their feet before he'd finished getting through the doorway. "East fence," Jesse said, chest heaving. "3 men. They're not cutting wire this time." He looked at Daniel. "They've got torches." Daniel was already moving. He had his rifle off the wall before Jesse finished the sentence, checking the load with the practiced speed of a man who had done it 1,000 times. Margaret crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and pulled the shotgun from the shelf above the door, the one Daniel had shown her the second day. The one he'd said was for emergencies, and please God, we never need it. "Jesse, ring the bell," she said. Jesse stared at her. "The bell's for—" "Ring it loud, and don't stop until someone comes." She checked the shotgun. "Go." Jesse went. The ranch bell was mounted on the post between the house and the barn. An old signal bell, the kind that carried for miles in open country. Margaret had had Jesse oil the mechanism the first week, because she had understood even then that there might come a morning when they needed to be heard. The bell started ringing as she and Daniel moved out across the yard. The 3 men at the east fence were not hiding. That was the first thing Margaret registered as they came into range. They were standing in the open, 2 of them holding lit torches, the third watching the approach to the ranch with his hand near his gun. Blackwood's men didn't hide anymore. They had decided, apparently, that the time for subtlety was finished. The leader was a broad man with a red beard and the particular expression of someone who had done this kind of work before and found it unremarkable. "Carter," he said, "Blackwood's given you enough time." Daniel stopped 10 yards out. His rifle was in his hands, not raised. "Put out those torches. You're going to want to listen to what I'm saying first. I've listened to everything Blackwood sent me for 3 years. Daniel's voice was completely flat. "I'm done listening. Put out the torches, or I will." The man smiled. "There's 3 of us." "There's 2 of us with guns," Margaret said from Daniel's left. "And that bell's been ringing for 2 minutes, which means there are 4 more ranches inside hearing distance who have been waiting for exactly this moment." She kept the shotgun level and her voice steady. "You want to still be standing in this field when they arrive?" The man's smile faded. He looked at her, then he looked at Daniel, then he looked back at Margaret, and she could see him recalculating. This was not what he'd expected when he rode out here this morning. He'd expected a stubborn rancher and an empty yard. What he'd gotten was different. He made a decision. He dropped his torch and ground it into the dirt with his boot. The second torchman, younger and less certain, did the same a half-second later. "This ain't over," Redbeard said. "No," Margaret agreed. "It ain't." They rode off. Margaret lowered the shotgun slowly. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. It was hitting the inside of her chest with the hard insistence of a fist knocking at a door. But her hands were steady because she had decided 2 minutes ago that they would be. And she had learned a long time ago that the body mostly did what you told it to if you told it clearly enough. Daniel turned to look at her. "You bluffed," he said. "I estimated," she corrected. "The Pattersons are inside bell range. So are the Okafors. Whether any of them actually come—" She paused. But he didn't know that. Daniel looked at the empty fence line for a moment. Then he let out a long breath. And then, from the north track, came the sound of horses. 2 of them, moving fast. Margaret turned. It was Samuel Okafor and his younger brother Marcus, riding in hard with rifles across their saddles, both of them scanning the yard as they pulled up. "We heard the bell," Samuel said. "What happened?" Margaret looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at her, and something passed between them in that look. Not words, not yet, but the particular understanding of two people who have just discovered, in the same moment, that they are not as alone as they thought they were. "Come inside," Margaret said to the Okafors. "We need to talk." It was that evening, while she was writing up the incident for her tin box. Dates, names, descriptions, the specific language used, that Jesse knocked on her doorframe. She looked up. He was holding something. A folded piece of cloth, or... No. As he came forward and set it on the desk, she saw it was a small canvas bag, knotted at the top. "Found it under the loose board in the barn," he said, "where I keep my wages." His voice was careful. "Wasn't there yesterday." She untied the bag. Inside was a single gold coin and a folded piece of paper. The paper had 4 words on it. "Ask about Emily Dawson." Margaret stared at it. "Who's Emily Dawson?" Jesse asked. "I don't know," she said. "Yet." She asked Daniel that night after supper. He frowned at the name for a moment, turning it over. Then something shifted in his face. "Dawson," he said. "There was a family. Worked on Blackwood's property. Father was a hand there, couple years back. I remember because he came to me once asking about work. Said things weren't right at the Blackwood place." He paused. "I didn't have anything for him at the time. Then I heard the family left the territory." "All of them?" A pause. "I assumed. But if there was a daughter..." Margaret looked at the note again. "Someone inside Blackwood's operation put this under your hand's floorboard. Someone who knows the layout of this ranch, which means someone who's been on this property, either as Blackwood's observer or as someone who wanted to reach us without being seen." "A warning," Daniel said. "Or an offer." She folded the note carefully. "Someone wants us to find Emily Dawson, which means Emily Dawson knows something." The next morning, she sent Jesse to Red Creek. Not Daniel. Daniel's face was too well known, and she didn't want anyone reporting back to Blackwood that Carter was asking questions. She sent Jesse with a specific list of instructions. Go to the dry goods store, the barber, the hotel kitchen. Talk to the women who worked the laundry. Ask quietly about a girl named Emily Dawson, around 16 or 17, who might have been connected to the Blackwood property. Jesse came back at dusk. He'd found something. There was a woman named Rosa who ran the hotel laundry in Red Creek, and Rosa knew everyone's business because everyone brought their clothes to Rosa and people talked while they waited. Rosa had mentioned, to Jesse's carefully casual questioning, that there was a girl staying in the back room of the Methodist church. Reverend Hale's wife had taken her in 3 weeks ago. Young, maybe 15. Wouldn't give her last name. Hadn't left the building since she arrived. Scared was the word Rosa had used. Scared like something was still chasing her. Margaret made the decision in about 30 seconds. "I'm going to Red Creek tomorrow," she told Daniel. "I'll come with you." "No." She said it clearly, but not unkindly. A woman going to speak with a frightened girl at a church is ordinary. A rancher who's in a land dispute with the most powerful man in the valley riding in the same day? That's a story. Stories get back to people. She looked at him steadily. "I'll take the supply wagon. I have eggs and bread to deliver to the hotel anyway." He didn't like it. She could see that plainly on his face. The set of his jaw, the way his hands stilled at the table. But he also didn't argue with the logic. "Be back before dark," he said. "I will." She wasn't back before dark. The Methodist church in Red Creek was a modest building on the quieter end of town, and Reverend Hale's wife, a practical woman named Judith with the handshake of someone who had never been afraid of hard work, met Margaret at the side door and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You're from the Carter Ranch," Judith said. It wasn't a question. "I am. How did you hear about her?" "Someone left me a note." Margaret held Judith's gaze. "Someone who wants her story told to the right people." Judith studied her for another moment. Then she stood aside and let Margaret through. Emily Dawson was sitting at a small table in the back room with a Bible open in front of her that she clearly wasn't reading. She was slight, dark-haired, with the kind of careful stillness that came not from calm, but from practice. The specific, exhausting practice of making yourself small so that nothing noticed you. She looked up when Margaret came in. Her eyes went to the door behind her, checking for anyone else. There was no one else. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," Margaret said, pulling out a chair across the table and sitting down without asking. Not aggressively, just normally, the way you sat with someone you intended to talk to as an equal. "I work at the Carter Ranch. I'm told you know something about Edgar Blackwood." Emily's hands tightened on the Bible. "Who told you that?" "I don't know who," Margaret said honestly. "But whoever it was, they left me a gold coin and your name. Which means they thought you mattered. And they thought I could help." A long silence. Emily looked down at the table. When she looked back up, something in her face had shifted. She was still scared, but she was also measuring something. The way people measure the distance of a jump before they commit to it. "My father worked for Blackwood for 2 years, she said. "He handled the books, the real books, not the ones Blackwood shows the marshal." She stopped. "My father's gone. He tried to leave with the records and Blackwood's men found him on the road." Her voice didn't waver, but the color left her face completely. "I got away. I had copies of 2 pages that my father gave me before they found him. He said if anything happened, I should find someone who was fighting Blackwood and wasn't afraid." The room was very still. "Do you still have those pages?" Margaret asked. Emily reached into the front of her dress and pulled out 2 folded sheets of paper, worn at the creases from being carried close to her body. She set them on the table. Margaret looked at them. They were account ledger pages, columns of figures, dates, property names. She could read enough of it to understand what she was looking at. Payments made to Marshal Denton in Red Creek, recorded plainly, the amounts and dates listed as methodically as feed costs. Blackwood had been paying the marshal, in writing, in his own records. "Emily," Margaret kept her voice absolutely steady. "You have been carrying this for how long?" 3 weeks. "You've been in this room for 3 weeks because you were afraid Blackwood would find out? He has men everywhere." The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who to trust." Margaret thought about a man who had paid 3 months of wages for a stranger's dignity. She thought about a boy of 16 who had showed up without hesitation when a bell rang. She thought about Samuel Okafor, riding in hard in the dark, rifle across his saddle, no questions asked. She thought about what it meant to know who to trust, and how you learned it, and what it cost when you got it wrong, and what it gave you when you got it right. She reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. "You can trust us," she said. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Margaret had walked in, the girl's carefully held stillness broke. Not into tears, but into something that looked like the first exhale after a very long time of holding your breath. "What do I do?" Emily asked. "You come with me," Margaret said, "and you let us finish this." She helped Emily gather the 3 things she had in that room: a change of clothes, a small photograph, and a worn leather-bound journal her father had given her. She thanked Judith Hale with a kind of directness that communicated more than gratitude. And then she put Emily in the supply wagon and drove back toward the Carter Ranch through the full dark of the Arizona night. The stars spread wide and hard and indifferent overhead, the wagon wheels cutting the quiet. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Emily said quietly, "They killed my father, didn't they?" It was not entirely a question. Margaret kept her eyes on the track ahead. "I don't know that for certain," she said, "but I think that's what those records will prove. And when a federal judge reads them, and he will, in less than 2 weeks now, Edgar Blackwood will lose everything he built. Every piece of it." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Will it matter?" she asked. "To people like him? Does it ever actually matter?" Margaret thought about that. She thought about every time in her life she had watched something unjust resolve itself, and every time she had watched it not resolve itself, and the particular grim mathematics of trying to figure out which kind of world you were living in. "Sometimes," she said, "when enough people stand up at the same time, in the same direction." She glanced at the girl beside her. "That's what we've been building." The ranch lights appeared in the dark ahead. The warm yellow square of the kitchen window, the lamp Daniel had left burning in the yard. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest at the sight of it. She pulled the wagon into the yard, and Daniel was already at the door. And when he saw the girl on the seat beside Margaret, his face asked the question before his mouth did. "This is Emily Dawson," Margaret said, climbing down. "She has proof." Daniel looked at Emily, then at Margaret, then at the tin box she was already carrying toward the house. He held the door open. "Come inside," he said, and the Carter Ranch, which had nearly broken under the weight of 3 years of grief and isolation and deliberate, patient cruelty, closed its door on the Arizona night with something new inside its walls. Something that had been assembled piece by piece over 3 weeks of early mornings and hard rides and quiet alliances. The solid, unshakable architecture of people who had decided, all at once, that they were done being afraid. 2 weeks remained before the federal judge arrived in Red Creek. Blackwood didn't know what was coming. But it was coming. Emily slept in Margaret's room that first night. Not because Margaret had offered. She had simply shown the girl where the cot was, set a clean blanket at the foot of it, and said, "Get some rest," in the tone she used when she meant it as an order, rather than a suggestion. Emily had sat down on the edge of the cot and been asleep inside 3 minutes, still half-dressed, the leather journal her father had given her clutched against her chest. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Daniel and the 2 ledger pages spread between them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The pages were meticulous. That was what made them so damning. Blackwood's bookkeeper, Emily's father, a man named Robert Dawson, who had apparently believed at some point that careful records protected you, had documented everything in the precise, even columns of someone trained to account for every penny. Payments to Marshall Denton, listed monthly, going back 4 years. A notation beside 2 of the larger payments read simply, "Land dispute resolved." Another line, dated 18 months ago, read, "Navarro matter, final settlement." The word settlement was doing a great deal of dishonest work. "This is enough," Daniel said. "It's enough for Denton," Margaret agreed. "It proves the marshal was paid. It proves Blackwood was paying him." She looked at the dates. "Combined with the fraudulent debt notices we already have, and the testimony from the Patterson family and the Okafors, it builds a complete picture." "Will the judge act on it?" "A federal circuit judge who finds documented bribery of a territorial marshal?" She looked at him steadily. "He will act on it, or he will have to explain to the district court in Phoenix why he didn't." She paused. "I'm going to write it all out tonight, every piece, in order, with dates, cross-referenced. So when we walk into that courtroom in 11 days, there is no confusion about what we're presenting." Daniel looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made the shadows move. Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. You've been carrying this entire operation for 3 weeks. The documents, the families, the strategy." He stopped. "I need you to know that I see that." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not doing it to be seen." "I know. That's why I'm saying it." She looked back down at the ledger pages. "Get some sleep, Mr. Carter," she said. "We have 11 days." She wrote until 2 in the morning. By the time she set down her pen, she had 14 pages of careful, cross-referenced documentation. A complete narrative of Edgar Blackwood's operation, supported at every point by either a signed witness statement, a primary document, or dated physical evidence. She read it through twice, corrected 3 small errors, and added it to the tin box with the ledger pages on top. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. She was tired. Properly tired. Not the surface exhaustion of physical work, but the deeper kind that came from sustained vigilance. The kind of tired that accumulated when you could not afford to stop paying attention. She had not stopped paying attention in 3 weeks. She had barely stopped moving. But she had also not felt this clear-headed in years. There was something about having a purpose that was larger than survival. Not just keeping yourself fed and housed and functional, but actually building towards something, working in the direction of a specific justice that burned differently, cleaner. She thought about what she'd told Emily in the wagon. Sometimes, when enough people stand up at the same time, in the same direction, she hoped she was right about that. She had staked several lives on it. The trouble came on a Sunday, which she would later think was typical of men like Blackwood. They had no respect for anything, not even the calendar. She was returning from delivering eggs to the Red Creek Hotel. Emily had stayed at the ranch, under strict instructions from Margaret to stay inside, and visible only to Daniel and Jesse, when she saw the crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Not the marshal's office. The sheriff's office, which was a different and less compromised institution. The territorial sheriff having no relationship with Blackwood that Margaret had been able to identify. She pulled the wagon up and looked. Marshal Denton was standing on the steps with 2 of his deputies, and across from him was Samuel Okafor. Samuel was standing very straight, his arms at his sides, and even from 20 yards away, Margaret could read the tension in his body. The controlled fury of a man who was holding himself together through sheer will. She climbed down from the wagon. She heard the tail end of it as she pushed through the outer edge of the gathering. "The warrant is legal," Denton was saying, in the flat tone of a man who knew he was lying and had decided not to care. "The debt is documented and witnessed. Mr. Okafor, if you don't vacate the property within 48 hours..." "The debt is fabricated," Samuel said, "and you know it." "Are you calling me a liar in front of witnesses?" "I'm calling a fabricated debt fabricated." Samuel's voice was absolutely steady. "In front of witnesses." Margaret walked up through the crowd and stood beside Samuel without hesitation. Denton's eyes moved to her. Something shifted in them. She was not what he'd expected. A woman stepping up out of a Sunday crowd. But he recognized her. She could see that. She was the woman from the Carter Ranch. The woman Blackwood had written to. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and the way he said it made it clear that he knew exactly who she was. "Marshal," she matched his tone precisely. "I'm going to need you to explain the legal basis for this warrant to me carefully, because I intend to copy it word for word and deliver it to Judge Harlan Morrison when he arrives in Red Creek in 10 days. The crowd went quiet. Denton blinked. "Judge Morrison's schedule is..." "I wrote to Judge Morrison's clerk 6 days ago," Margaret said. "He's confirmed the circuit date." She had done no such thing, but her voice was so completely certain that the bluff landed clean. "I also sent him a preliminary summary of the property disputes in this valley." He expressed interest in reviewing the documentation. She looked at Denton steadily. So, the legal basis for this warrant, please. Denton stared at her. Then he looked past her, and she turned slightly and saw one of Blackwood's men at the edge of the crowd. A watcher, reporting back. He met her eyes briefly, and then looked away. "This matter can be resolved at a later date," Denton said, his voice losing about 30% of its certainty. "Mr. Okafor, you will receive written notice of the formal proceedings." He went inside. Samuel let out a slow breath beside her. "Did you actually write to the judge?" he said quietly. "I will this afternoon," she said. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained the same release. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I am very glad you came to this valley." "So am I," she said. "Come to the ranch tonight. I want you to see what we have." That evening, with Samuel and Marcus Okafor and Thomas Patterson's father seated at the kitchen table, Margaret opened the tin box. She laid it out in order: the witness statements, the fraudulent debt notices, the ledger pages from Robert Dawson's records, her own 14-page summary, each piece in sequence, each one building on the last, the whole thing accumulating into something that had weight and shape and the particular density of truth that has been documented carefully. Emily sat in the corner with her journal, not eating, watching the faces of the men around the table as they read. James Patterson, Thomas's father, a ranched man of 60, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent years watching for threats, got to the ledger pages and went completely still. "He wrote it down," James said. "His bookkeeper wrote it down," Margaret said. "The man was thorough. Denton's name is right here." James tapped the page. "Dates, amounts. This isn't just testimony. This is a record." "Yes." James looked up at her. "You've had this for 3 days, and you didn't tell us immediately because I needed it organized before anyone saw it," she said. "Because a stack of papers means nothing to a judge. A coherent, cross-referenced case means everything." She looked around the table. "We have 10 days. I need each of you to write a final statement. Clean copy, dated, signed in front of a witness. Everything you've experienced directly. Property threats, water damage, conversations with Blackwood's men. Specific dates wherever you can remember them." Samuel Okafor leaned forward. "And Denton? He'll know the judge is coming. He might try to interfere." "Denton is already scared," Margaret said. "You saw him this morning. He's calculating his own position." She paused. "A corrupt man who realizes the protection above him is about to collapse is a man who starts thinking about how to survive the collapse. He may try to run. He may try to cut a deal first." She looked at Daniel across the table. "Which is why we need to move before he does." Daniel had been quiet through most of this, listening with that focused attention he brought to everything she said. Now he spoke. "The newspaper," he said. She looked at him. "You mentioned early on. A reporter from Phoenix." He leaned forward. "A story running in the Phoenix paper before the judge arrives changes the political pressure. If Blackwood's operation is public knowledge, if his name is in print before the hearing, he can't make evidence disappear. He can't lean on the judge. It becomes too visible." Margaret stared at him. It was a good idea. It was a very good idea, and she hadn't thought of it. And the fact that he had, quietly, sitting at that table, landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth she didn't immediately examine. "Do you know anyone at the Phoenix paper?" she asked. "I know someone who knows someone." His mouth moved slightly. "It's the territory. Everything is 2 people away from everything else. Get a message out tomorrow morning." He nodded. James Patterson looked between the two of them with an expression that said he was observing something he found interesting, but had the good sense not to comment on. "All right," James said. "Tell me what to write in this statement." The letter to the Phoenix Gazette went out Monday morning. By Wednesday, Margaret had all 4 signed statements in her tin box. By Thursday, she had written to Judge Morrison's clerk, in truth this time, a carefully worded letter that described the Valley situation in factual terms, requested the judge's awareness of the documentation that would be presented, and made it absolutely clear that multiple families were counting on the circuit court's integrity. She did not know if the letter would land, but she sent it. On Friday, one of Blackwood's men came to the ranch, not with torches, alone, in the middle of the day, riding up the main track without trying to be unobtrusive. He was maybe 30, with a face that hadn't decided yet what kind of man it belonged to. He had the look of someone who had taken this job because the pay was good, and was only now beginning to understand the full cost of what he was part of. Margaret met him in the yard. Daniel was behind her at a distance that was close enough to matter and far enough not to crowd her. Jessie was in the barn doorway. Emily had gone inside at Margaret's quiet instruction when they'd heard the rider coming. The man stopped his horse and looked down at Margaret. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. "There's no one here you can't speak in front of," she replied. He hesitated. Then he dismounted. "My name's Cole Briggs," he said. "I worked for Blackwood." He stopped. "I worked for him." He reached into his coat, and Margaret's hand moved to the shotgun on the post beside her. Just touched it, didn't raise it. And he saw that, and kept his hands visible and slow. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was the one who left the note under the floorboard," he said. "About the girl, Emily Dawson." The yard was completely silent. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" Cole looked at the ground. When he looked back up, something in his face was raw in a way that he was clearly not accustomed to showing. "Because I was there when they found her father on the road," he said. "And I did nothing." He paused. "I've been doing nothing for 2 years, and I'm tired of the weight of it." He held out the folded paper. "That's a signed statement," he said. "Everything I saw, everything I did. The Navarro property, the water poisoning, the road." His voice was level, but his hands were not entirely steady. "I know it means I'm done in this territory. I know it means I face charges too, probably. But the judge is coming, and if someone from inside Blackwood's operation doesn't testify—" He stopped. "He'll find a way to minimize the ledger pages. He'll call them forgeries. He needs a live witness." Margaret took the paper. She didn't open it yet. She looked at Cole Briggs for a long moment. The particular look she had developed over 56 years of reading men. The one that went past the surface to look for the shape of the intention underneath. She saw a man who had made a decision that was going to cost him considerably, and had made it anyway. "Come inside," she said. She brought Emily out from the back room. The two of them looked at each other. Emily, who had been carrying 2 pages of her father's records close to her body for 3 weeks, and Cole Briggs, who had been carrying 2 years of witnessed injustice somewhere in his chest. Emily said, "You were there that night." "Yes," Cole said. "Did he suffer?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "It was fast," he said. "I don't think he was afraid. He was trying to get somewhere. He was trying to get to you." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface. "Then tell the judge everything," she said. The Phoenix Reporter arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days before the circuit judge. He was young, younger than Margaret had expected, barely 25, with the over-eager energy of someone who understood that he had found something significant and was trying very hard not to show how excited he was. His name was Arthur Greer, and he had ridden up from Phoenix in 2 days after receiving Daniel's contact's message. Margaret sat with him for 3 hours. She showed him the documents in order. She let him read the ledger pages. She introduced him to Samuel Okafor, to James Patterson, to Cole Briggs. She did not let him speak with Emily. Emily had been through enough, and her testimony was for the judge, not a newspaper. Arthur Greer wrote very fast. When he finally put down his pencil, he looked at Margaret with an expression that had moved past eagerness into something more serious. "How did you build all of this in 3 weeks?" he asked. 4 weeks, she corrected. "And I had help." She glanced at Daniel, who was leaning against the kitchen wall with his arms crossed, watching. "The story is remarkable," Arthur said. "A woman who was—" He stopped, apparently reconsidering how to say it. "Sold at auction," Margaret said plainly. "You can say it. It's in the public record. 40 people watched." Arthur looked at her for a moment. "Yes. And within 4 weeks you organized an entire valley of ranchers, obtained primary documentation of bribery and land fraud, and brought in a witness from inside the operation." He paused. "Do you understand what that is?" "It's what needed doing," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore," he leaned forward slightly, "I've covered territorial disputes from Flagstaff to the New Mexico border. I've never seen anything like this." Margaret looked at him steadily. "That's because no one ever expected anything like this from someone like me," she said. "Which is, as it turns out, a considerable advantage." The article ran in the Phoenix Gazette the morning before Judge Morrison arrived in Red Creek. Blackwood saw it. Margaret knew he saw it because that same morning, 2 of his regular men were spotted riding east, fast, without luggage visible, toward the county line. Running. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee when Daniel came in and told her. She set down the cup. "How many left?" she asked. "At least 2, maybe more." He sat down across from her. "He's cutting loose what he can before the hearing." "He won't run himself," she said. "He's too arrogant. He still thinks he can face a judge and win." Daniel looked at her. "Can he?" She thought about the tin box. She thought about 14 pages of organized documentation, 4 signed statements, 2 ledger pages, and a live witness who had been inside Blackwood's operation for 2 years. "No," she said. She said it with the same certainty she had used in that yard when she'd told 3 men with torches that the Valley Ranchers were coming. Not performance, not bluster, just the clean, clear voice of someone who had looked at all the facts available and arrived at a conclusion. "He cannot win this," she said. And for the first time in 4 weeks, she let herself believe it completely. Daniel looked at her across that kitchen table, with the morning coming through the window and the Arizona summer already pressing against the walls. And he said something quiet and direct in the way he said everything. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "this valley is different because of you." She looked at him for a moment. "It's different because of all of us," she said. But she did not look away. And Daniel Carter, who had spent 3 years alone in a dying ranch, waiting for something he could not have named, understood in that moment, with the quiet certainty of a man who does not speak unless he means it, exactly what he was willing to fight for. Not just the land, not just the water rights, not just the valley. Tomorrow, Edgar Blackwood would walk into a courtroom that Margaret Whitmore had built, piece by careful piece. And he would not walk out of it the same way he walked in. That was not a hope. That was a fact. Judge Harlan Morrison arrived in Red Creek on a Wednesday morning, and he was not what Margaret had expected. She had built him up in her mind over the past 4 weeks into something almost abstract, a symbol of federal authority, a mechanism of justice. the thing all of this work had been pointing toward. What stepped off the afternoon stage was a compact man of 60-something with a gray beard, a worn leather satchel, and the mildly irritated expression of someone who had been traveling for 3 days and wanted a hot meal before he dealt with anything else. She found that reassuring. Abstract symbols could be bought or pressured or outmaneuvered. Tired, hungry men who wanted their supper had a very specific kind of impatience with nonsense. She was in Red Creek with Daniel, Emily, and Cole Briggs, the 4 of them arriving separately, at intervals, to avoid drawing attention before the hearing the following morning. She had the tin box in a canvas bag over her shoulder. She had not let it out of her sight in 2 days. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock. At 9:55, Margaret was seated in the front row of the Red Creek Meeting Hall, the largest space in town, pressed into service as a courtroom twice a year, with Daniel on her left and Samuel Okafor on her right. Behind them were James Patterson, Marcus Okafor, the widow Chen, and the dozen other Valley residents who had ridden in that morning without being asked, because word had traveled the way word traveled in a territory this size, fast and thorough. Edgar Blackwood was already seated across the room with his lawyer, a well-dressed man from Tucson who carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to winning. Blackwood himself was larger than Margaret had imagined. She had constructed him from descriptions and documents and the second-hand fear of people who had lived under his reach for years, and the reality was a broad-shouldered man of about 55, with the particular confidence of someone who had never, in his adult life, been held accountable for anything. He glanced at her when she sat down. His expression said that he knew exactly who she was, and that he was mildly curious about her, and that he was not worried. Margaret held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened the tin box and began organizing her documents on the table in front of her. She heard Blackwood say something to his lawyer in a low voice. She didn't look up. Judge Morrison ate his breakfast in 20 minutes and was on the bench at 10 o'clock precisely. He looked out at the packed room with the expression of a man doing a rapid calculation. "This is a land dispute matter," he said. "I've been told there is documentation to review. I am also told," he glanced at the pages his clerk had handed him, "that the Phoenix Gazette ran a story yesterday. I want to be clear that newspaper stories are not evidence. Evidence is evidence." He looked around the room. "Who is presenting the primary case?" Margaret stood up. There was a murmur through the room. Judge Morrison looked at her with no particular expression. "Your name?" "Margaret Whitmore. I'm representing the interests of the Carter Ranch and the Associated Valley landowners." "Are you an attorney, Mrs. Whitmore?" "No, Your Honor, but the landowners I represent cannot afford one, and the law allows a lay representative in territorial circuit hearings." She had verified this in a law reference book borrowed from Reverend Hale 3 weeks ago. "I have 14 pages of organized documentation, 4 signed witness statements, 2 pages of primary ledger records, and a live witness prepared to testify." Silence in the room. Judge Morrison studied her for a moment. "Proceed," he said. She had rehearsed it. Not the words exactly. She had learned long ago that scripted words went brittle under pressure, but the shape of it, the order, the logic. She knew exactly which piece came first and why, and she knew the thread that ran through all of it, and she held that thread and did not let go. She started with the fraudulent debt notices, concrete, documented, dated. She presented the Patterson family's notice alongside the Okafor notice, showing the identical language in both. Language that matched neither standard territorial debt law nor any legitimate lending institution's documentation. She watched Judge Morrison read them, watched his eyebrows draw slightly together. She moved to the witness statements, each one specific, dated, signed. Samuel Okafor's account of the direct threat made by Blackwood's man 2 years ago. James Patterson's documentation of the waterline sabotage. The widow Chen's record of the $1,200 offer made under conditions she had understood clearly as implicit threat. Blackwood's lawyer objected twice. Both times, Judge Morrison waved him off with the impatience of a man who had not ridden 3 days to be interrupted. Then Margaret set the ledger pages on the judge's table. She watched him read them. He read them once, then again. His expression did not change dramatically. He was too experienced for that. But something in his posture shifted. A settling. The particular quality of a man who has just seen the piece that makes everything else make sense. "These are from Blackwood's own records?" he said. "They were maintained by his bookkeeper, Robert Dawson, over a period of 4 years. Mr. Dawson is deceased." She paused. "His daughter will explain how she obtained them." Emily stood up. She had been sitting in the second row, and she rose slowly, and the room shifted its attention to her in a way that she handled with a steadiness that Margaret had watched her build over the past 10 days. Not confidence exactly, but the particular calm that comes from having made a decision about something difficult and stopped going back on it. She told her story in a clear, quiet voice. Her father's work, the records he kept, the night he tried to leave with copies of the most damning pages, the road. When she said the road, the room was completely silent. Blackwood's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. This child has no—" "Sit down," Judge Morrison said. The lawyer sat. Emily finished. Then Cole Briggs stood up. What Cole Briggs said in that room took 11 minutes and cost him everything he'd built in 2 years in the territory. And he said it all anyway, in the flat, even voice of someone who had already processed the cost and paid it before he started talking. He had been on Blackwood's property for 2 years. He had witnessed the water poisoning on the Carter Ranch, standing there while it was done, on Blackwood's direct instruction. He had been present when the Navarro family's eldest son was thrown from a horse that had been spooked deliberately on a trail that the rider used every day. He had been on the road the night Robert Dawson was found. He was careful about that last part. He described what he had seen without implicating himself beyond what was accurate. He had arrived after. He had not been part of what happened on that road. But he had seen the body, and he had seen who was there, and he named them. 2 of the names he gave were men who had been seen riding east 2 days ago. The third name made Blackwood's lawyer put down his pen. It was a name Margaret had not heard before, a name that meant something in the room. She could feel it in the collective stillness of 40 people processing the same information simultaneously. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Say that name again." Cole said it again. The judge looked at his clerk. Something passed between them that Margaret couldn't read. Then Morrison looked at Blackwood for the first time since the hearing had started. A long, level look with nothing polite in it. Blackwood's lawyer leaned toward his client and began speaking rapidly in an undertone. Blackwood's face had not changed. That was the thing Margaret noticed. He still had that same mild, assessing expression, the confidence of a man who had never lost. But there was something underneath it now. The first thin crack, like a hairline fracture in stone, that looked solid until you understood how deep it went. Judge Morrison called a 30-minute recess. Margaret sat in her chair and did not move. Daniel sat beside her and also did not move. After about 2 minutes, he put his hand over hers on the table. She looked down at it. She did not pull away. "You did it," he said quietly. "It's not done yet," she said. "Margaret?" His voice was very quiet. Just her name, with a weight in it she hadn't let herself examine until now. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her the morning after she'd gone to Red Creek alone for Emily, when he'd been standing in the yard with a lamp burning, waiting, and she had come back through the dark with a girl and a tin box and a plan. He'd looked at her then with something she had filed away carefully, the way she filed everything she wasn't ready for. She hadn't been ready for it then. She looked at his hand over hers on that table in the Red Creek meeting hall, surrounded by 40 Valley residents and the accumulated evidence of 4 weeks of work, and she thought, I have been wrong before about what men wanted. I have misjudged before. I have paid for misjudging. But she had also, in 56 years, developed a reliable sense of the difference between a man who wanted something from her and a man who simply wanted her. The way you learned the difference between a fence wire pulled too tight and one that was properly tensioned. You learned it through failure and through paying attention, and eventually, you just knew. She knew. She turned her hand over under his and held it. Neither of them said anything else. When Judge Morrison returned to the bench, his expression had changed. The 30-minute recess had clearly involved more than a cup of coffee. He sat down, arranged his papers, and looked out at the room with the focused attention of a man who had made a decision. I have reviewed the documentation presented by Mrs. Whitmore in its entirety, he said. I have particular concerns regarding the ledger records showing regular payments to Marshal Denton, which I find consistent with the other evidence presented, and which I am treating as credible primary documentation pending forensic verification. He paused. Marshal Denton. Denton was in the back of the room. Margaret had not looked at him during the hearing. She looked now. He had the particular stillness of a man who had been hoping he could become invisible, and had just discovered he could not. You are hereby suspended from your position, pending a full territorial investigation, Judge Morrison said. You will surrender your badge to my clerk before you leave this building. A sound went through the room. Not quite a gasp, something lower than that. The collective exhale of people who had lived under something heavy for a long time, and had just felt it lift slightly. Denton stood up slowly. His face was the color of old ash. He unpinned his badge and carried it to the clerk's table with the wooden movements of a man in shock. Judge Morrison turned to Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, the fraudulent debt notices presented today, combined with the witness testimony regarding deliberate property damage and the documented payments to a territorial official, constitutes sufficient grounds for criminal indictment on charges including land fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to deprive territorial citizens of their property rights. He looked at Blackwood steadily over his glasses. You are remanded to federal custody pending trial. Your properties in this territory are frozen, pending the outcome of those proceedings. Blackwood's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, on behalf of my client, sit down, counselor. You will have your opportunity at trial. Blackwood stood up slowly. He looked across the room at Margaret. She looked back at him. He had the expression of a man encountering something he had genuinely not expected. Not fear, not yet, but the first real recognition of a force he had underestimated. He had written her a letter. He had called her experienced. He had offered her a soft way out. He had never, in any calculation he'd made in 6 years of acquiring this valley, piece by piece, accounted for what she actually was. A woman who had been sold for $2 and had decided, quietly and methodically, to burn down everything he'd built. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then the federal marshal stepped forward and took him by the arm, and Edgar Blackwood walked out of that meeting hall, and the valley watched him go. The room erupted. Not in cheering exactly. It was too stunned for that. The particular dazed quality of people who had been bracing for impact for so long that the impact not coming left them briefly uncertain of their own balance. Then Samuel Okafor said something to his brother in a low voice, and Marcus laughed, and James Patterson's face cracked open into an expression Margaret had not seen on it before. Relief so profound, it looked almost like grief, the way the two things lived close together. The widow Chen appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Well," she said. "Well," Margaret agreed. Chen looked at her for a moment. Then she did something Margaret had not expected. She took Margaret's hand in both of hers, the dry, firm grip of a woman who had run a ridge property alone for 9 years, and held it for a moment without speaking. She didn't need to say anything. Margaret understood. Emily was standing near the door, and when Margaret looked at her, the girl's face was doing something complicated, working through layers of grief and relief, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something terrible for a long time and had just set it down. Margaret crossed to her and put a hand on her shoulder, and Emily leaned in slightly, the small, involuntary lean of someone who needed steadying. "He's going to trial," Emily said. "Yes. And Cole's testimony about the road will be part of the federal prosecution." Margaret looked at her. "Your father's records are the foundation of the entire case. What he did, keeping those pages, getting them to you, it matters. It's what brought all of this down." Emily was quiet for a moment. "He knew they'd find out," she said. "He went anyway." "Yes," Margaret said. "He did." She let that sit. Outside, the Arizona summer was indifferent and enormous as ever, the heat pressing against every surface, the sky its flat, hard blue. Margaret walked out of the meeting hall into it and stood for a moment on the steps. Daniel came and stood beside her. "What happens to Denton's cases?" he asked. "The debt notices, the warrants." "Vacated. The judge said so in chambers. His clerk told me during the recess. Every warrant Denton issued in the last 4 years is under review." She looked out across the dusty street. "The Patterson debt notice is gone. The Okafors are clear. Mrs. Chen's property is confirmed in her name." She paused. "The Navarro family. Someone should find the Navarro family." "I'll look into it," Daniel said. She nodded. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, Valley residents were talking in small groups, the particular energized conversation of people processing the same significant event from different angles. Arthur Greer from the Phoenix Gazette was writing in his notebook very fast near the edge of the steps. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called over, "can I quote you for the follow-up piece?" "Briefly," she said. He came over. "How does it feel, bringing down an operation like Blackwood's, as someone who came to this valley?" He glanced at his notes. "4 weeks ago, under the circumstances that you did." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about a wooden platform in the summer heat and 40 people watching, and the particular quality of her own breathing in that moment. Slow and deliberate, because she had decided her breathing would be slow and deliberate. Because the last thing she would give any of them was the sight of her afraid. She thought about a man stepping out of a crowd with a leather pouch of coins, and the particular way he had taken off his hat. She thought about a tin box under a cot that now held, alongside a worn photograph and a document she never wanted to think about again, 14 pages of organized truth that had just walked into a federal hearing and done exactly what it was built to do. "It feels like work," she said, "which is all it ever was." Arthur wrote that down. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon in the supply wagon, Daniel driving, Emily sitting in the back with her leather journal open in her lap. Margaret beside Daniel on the bench, with a canvas bag containing the empty tin box at her feet. She had left the documents with Judge Morrison's clerk. She had kept the photograph. About a mile from the ranch, Daniel said, I need to ask you something." She had been half watching the road ahead and half somewhere else, in that particular mental state that comes after a sustained effort finally completes. Not emptiness exactly, but a kind of quiet that felt earned. "Ask," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "When this started, when I asked you to come to the ranch, I told you I needed someone who knew what they were doing. That was true." He paused. "What I didn't say, because I didn't know how to say it, and it wasn't the right time, was that I hadn't—" Another pause, the kind that comes when a person is being careful about something that matters. "I hadn't cared about keeping the ranch since Eleanor and my daughter died. I was going through the motions. I'd already decided, on some level, that losing it was what I deserved." The wagon rolled on. "And then," Margaret said, "and then you got in this wagon and asked me how many head of cattle before we'd cleared the county line." He said it with that almost smile. "And I thought, this woman is going to save this ranch, whether I want her to or not." She looked at him. "I wanted to," she said. "I know. That's what changed things." He was quiet for a moment. "You saved more than the ranch, Margaret." She was quiet. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know it." She thought about what she had told herself on the first night, that she was reserving judgment, that she had been wrong before, that she needed to understand what he wanted before she trusted any of it. She had spent 4 weeks watching him. She had watched him take direction without offense. She had watched him ride at dawn when she asked him to, carry coffee without being asked, hold the door for Emily without making a performance of it. She had watched him stand in the yard with a rifle while she bluffed 3 men into leaving, and she had watched him sit at that table for 3 weeks and never once try to take credit for something she had built. She had watched him put his hand over hers in a courtroom and say her name like it meant something. "Mr. Carter," she said. He turned to look at her. "Daniel," she corrected herself. Something in his face went quiet and very still, the way it went when something landed that he hadn't been certain of until it did. "I am 56 years old," she said. "I have been a wife and a widow and a farm worker and a woman sold at auction for $2. I have buried a child and outlasted a drought and been betrayed by the last family I had." She looked at him steadily. "I am not interested in being taken care of. I am not interested in being rescued twice. But I find that I am very interested in continuing to work alongside the man who stepped onto that platform and treated me like a person when 40 others didn't." She paused. "If that man feels similarly—" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That man," he said quietly, "has felt similarly since approximately the moment you asked him about his cattle." She looked back at the road. Something loosened in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time. Longer than 4 weeks, longer than 14 months with Clarence. Longer, perhaps, than she had understood until this moment. Not a dramatic loosening, just the quiet relief of a knot finally releasing after you've stopped fighting it. Behind them in the wagon bed, Emily very deliberately opened her journal and began writing in it with great concentration, which Margaret recognized as the tactful pretense of a 15-year-old girl giving 2 adults a moment. The Carter Ranch in the weeks that followed was a different place. Not transformed overnight. Margaret had no patience for that kind of story, the kind where everything resolved into a clean, sudden happiness. Life didn't move that way, and she had no interest in pretending it did. The cattle still needed tending. The south fence still needed checking. The egg delivery to the Red Creek Hotel happened twice a week because the ranch needed the income, and it would for some time yet. But the valley was different. The Pattersons kept their land. The Okafors started planning an expansion of their herd for the first time in 3 years. The widow Chen came by the Carter Ranch one afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches and sat at the kitchen table for an hour talking with Margaret about water management. And it was the kind of conversation that was about water management on the surface and about two women who had survived considerable things below it. Emily stayed. No formal arrangement was made about it. No papers signed, no ceremony. She simply stayed and helped with the chickens, and sat with Margaret in the evenings sometimes. And gradually, the tightness around her eyes when she woke up in the morning began to loosen, in the way that things loosen when people stop bracing for the next blow. One evening, about 3 weeks after the hearing, she looked up from her father's journal. She had been reading through it slowly, the way you read something that is painful and precious in equal measure, and said to Margaret, "He would have liked you." Margaret looked up from the account books. "He liked people who did what needed doing," Emily said, without making a speech about it. Margaret held the girl's gaze. "Your father did what needed doing," she said. "Don't forget that. Whatever else happened, he kept those records. He got them to you. He made a choice that cost him everything." She paused. "That's not nothing. That's not small." Emily nodded slowly. "No," she said. "It's not." The Harvest Festival came in late September. Red Creek held it in the town square, the same square where, 4 months earlier, Margaret Whitmore had stood barefoot on a wooden platform while 40 people decided what she was worth. The square looked different with lanterns strung across it and tables laid with food contributed from a dozen ranches. It sounded different, the particular sound of a community that had come through something together, a little louder than usual, a little less guarded. Margaret arrived with Daniel and Emily and Jessie, who had grown an inch and a half in 4 months, and had developed the specific confidence of a boy who had stood in the yard with a rifle and rung a bell when it counted. People came to speak to her. Not all of them. Some of the same 40 who had watched the auction still looked past her, the way people look past things they'd rather not examine. But enough. James Patterson shook her hand. Samuel Okafor brought his mother over specifically to introduce her. Judith Hale, from the church, found her early and said simply, "We're glad you're here," in the tone of someone who meant all of the words in that sentence. She stood at the edge of the square at one point, a cup of cider in her hand, watching the town move around her. The familiar negotiation of a community finding its new shape after a disruption. And Daniel appeared beside her. "How does it feel?" he asked. It was the same question Arthur Greer had asked her on the courthouse steps, but different in his mouth. Less about the record, more about her. She thought about it honestly. "Like something that belongs to me," she said. He looked at her. "The valley? The work? This?" She gestured, not quite at the square, not quite at him, somewhere that encompassed both and more. "I came here with one bag and a photograph. I didn't expect—" She stopped. "I stopped expecting things a long time ago. It was safer. And now?" She looked at him. "Now I think I was wrong about that," she said. "About the safety of not expecting things." She paused. "Turns out it just means you stop looking. And if you stop looking, you miss what's actually there." Daniel Carter, who had stood on a platform for a stranger and spent 4 months watching her rebuild everything he'd given up on, reached out and took her hand the same way he had in the courtroom. Not performance, not announcement, just the quiet decision of a man who knew what he wanted and had stopped being afraid of it. She held it. Around them, the Harvest Festival moved in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. Voices carrying across the square, the smell of food and lantern smoke, the wide Arizona night pressing gently down on all of it. Margaret Whitmore, who had been sold for $2 on a summer morning and had decided somewhere in the long ride south on a wagon bench that she was not finished, stood in the town square of Red Creek with her hand in Daniel Carter's and let herself be exactly where she was. Not rescued, not surviving, not invisible. Here. And that, after 56 years of early mornings and hard winters, and the particular labor of a woman who kept going because there was no one else to do it. That was everything. That was more than enough. That was hers.